Hey, Craig.
Hi, David.
Uh, hey, Lennox Kalifungwa.
He puts the fun in Kalifungwa.
It's actually, I'm so impressed that you just said his name correctly because
I know, so am I. Don't make me say it again.
He said, before we recorded the episode, he said, if you can say California, you can say Kalifungwa, which I think now everyone knows how to say his name. So he was fun. I'm going to say that. He was really fun. You said it was one of your favorite episodes we've recorded. Why is that?
Just the clarity with which he spoke. I think he hit a lot of really important ideas and concepts of piety and the problem of piety, the drive of good, godly ambition, and just the encouragement to go and build things. A lot of things, a lot of fruit hanging on the tree that I think people will be able to pick and eat. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. That's what you do. You pick it and you eat it.
Amen.
A lot of low-hanging fruit for people that I think might encourage them in their lives. And a lot of reoccurring themes about starting, the change starts in your own family, which is that's a reoccurring theme.
Yeah, I love that. And he's got real clarity of thought and real focused thought. So I think it's going to be a really helpful episode for you guys. So stick around and listen to Lennox Kalifungwa. Welcome to Kingdom and Culture, where we equip the King's wardens to know his charge and labor unto glory. I'm David, and with me as always is my co-host Craig. And we interview thinkers and theologians from around the world to explore the themes of faith, culture, and the lordship of Christ. All right. Hey, guys, we're back with another episode of Kingdom and Culture. And today we've got a really fun guest. We've got Lennox Kalifungwa here with us. So right away, Lennox, I'll pass it over to you. Will you introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what you do and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm Lennox Kalifungwa. I am a husband and a father and a communicator and who wears many hats doing that sort of thing. The last several years I've been in the world of Christian worldview formation and apologetics, and I write quite a bit on these kinds of subjects and speak about it as well. And I'm also with New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, and helping them with their communications efforts. So that's me.
That's great. Thanks for coming on.
Of course.
You're not originally from Moscow, are you? When did you get to Moscow?
Yeah, so got to Moscow about 7 months ago, actually.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I'm still relatively new to Moscow. I had come here from Zambia, which is a country in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh, that's great. How'd you get connected with Moscow?
Honestly, the best answer I can give to that is the miraculous providence of God.
Amen.
I mean, some of the connections that just happened over time were incredible. But I was part of a university in Zambia that is very like New St. Andrews College in terms of an emphasis on Christian education and emphasis on classical education. I'd been involved with it for several years. And I suppose that world is kind of small, and so you make connections across different lines. And a couple years ago, I connected with some people from New St. Andrews College, and we connected really well. And eventually, I was invited to come out here and join their efforts.
Incredible. Well, that's fun. What's great about them, what I've seen from your stuff, and I've started following you probably within the last 7 months or so. Your podcast has come out, Of Flames and Crown. Is that correct?
That's right, Of Flames and Crowns.
And so I've been listening to that and following you on Substack, and so I think you're going to have a interesting take on our theme of the season is negative world. So let's
Yes.
Get into that. The first question we like to ask guys this season is, are you? I imagine you're familiar with Aaron Renn's negative world, and are you in agreement with it? Do you think that he's kind of spot on the money with his assessment? Where do you think he's at, with that?
Yes, I'm familiar with the concept, and I think that Aaron is right on the money with it. And it's interesting, coming from outside the USA, I'd actually say that what he's describing is actually a universal phenomenon of sorts. Definitely, I think some nations around the world might be at different stages in his paradigm of where things fall. But I'd say by and large, his assessment is quite spot on. And I would agree that we are very much in negative world at the moment.
I'm curious, what, sorry, David, I'm going to interrupt you.
No, that's great.
Coming from the outside is probably gives you a great perspective, like a more global perspective on this phenomenon. What do you think? And oftentimes, as a Westerner, we think the world revolves around us, and we often don't think about cultural phenomenons happening. If it's happening in our place, it's happening globally. I imagine everyone probably thinks that about their regions, but from an outsider perspective, how does that give you a unique lens into where you think we're at versus where Zambia was at?
That's an excellent question. I think the contrast I would draw between those two contexts is America has entered a negative world having abandoned their Christian heritage by and large. A country like Zambia is still a relatively young and new country that has no Christian heritage to speak of. In many ways, this is when those foundational blocks are being formed only now. And it's interesting. I think the overlap, between the two contexts would be similar philosophies that have permeated both contexts. For example, secularism. Secular humanism dominates much of the educational landscape across many African countries, across most of the world, honestly. And you do see some overlap there with the United States. Although in comparison, I would say that the United States still fills me with a lot of hope and encouragement. I think the most formidable resistance against the rot of negative world is centered in the United States, and that's something we ought to be very grateful for.
That's great. When I first saw the trailer for your podcast, something that really stuck out to me in there is you mentioned how the church has discipled nations into the current chaos. The
Yes.
church crippled by pietism, survivalism, apathy, fearfulness, and effeminacy.
Right.
So, to expand on that, I'm wondering, what do you think is the church's role in negative world coming about or encouraging negative world? And, not to just end maybe on the bummer note, but what role do you think the church has in maybe bringing us out of negative world or dealing with negative world?
Yes. My take on this is really that the church is actually responsible for the chaos that we see around us today.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because I think that the church has been given truth and wisdom and freedom and fruitfulness as a part of just who we are. There's a sense in which the power is really on our side. We're the ones who worship the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, to whom all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to. He is reigning, he is ruling, he has given us a mandate that will be successful. The nations will be discipled. And I think that when we understand that, and you see what the world is today, one has to ask, why is it that us sons of God, us people who have this power, capability to shape worlds, have kind of left the nations to themselves. Why are the nations in chaos today? And it is my firm belief that our unbelief is actually what has prompted and ushered the world into this chaos. I don't think we really know who we are. I don't think we really know what Christ has redeemed us for, and that's played a big role in this. Another way I could frame this is, I think the cowardice of Christians and the church is more potent than the courage of devils. And if we really understood who we are, if we really understood who Christ has redeemed us to be, I think we would turn this world upside down. And so I think the impotence of the church in its apathy and unbelief is really what's prompted a lot of this mess.
Well, the turn the world upside down phrase, I love that. I mean, it's Acts 17. That's how they described what they were doing. They were turning the world upside down. And so
Exactly.
It almost sounds as if you're saying, like, as the church goes, the society goes.
Absolutely. Another way I could actually put that as well is the culture or society is the resume of the church. The culture is a consequence, an overflow of what happens in religion, and that's how God has made the world. We tend to function as cultures and societies on the basis of what we worship. And that's true even in this case.
Well, and even like comparing to the Zambia situation, it sounds like you're saying Zambia never had that foundation, and now it's just kind of starting to grow, and it could become a positive world at some point. We had that, and we let it go, and so we're on this cycle of trying to recover that which we once had. I am curious, when you talk about the cowardice, like, where do you think the church was cowardly? Like, where do you think some of those key spots have been?
Yes, I think there's several answers I could give to this. What I'll begin with is, I think at the turn of the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment was coming in, secularism really began to take a hold on the consciences and minds of many people, and to that the church essentially said a very hearty amen. And by that I mean, that's, I think, the point at which we really bought into Pietism, which I see as the other face of secularism. So on one hand, you have the godless who want to remove God from everything, from society. At best, they may say, you can worship your God in that little corner over there, but we don't need him for the rest of this. And Christians effectively said, yes, you're right. In fact, he only does care about the church and the salvation of men anyway. The rest of the world does not belong to him. And so I think our failure to reckon with the sovereignty of God, with the lordship of Jesus Christ, is essentially what's enabled that. It's been it's been very costly. Another way I've heard this being illustrated is, I recently had a conversation with Vishal Mangalwadi, who's a Indian philosopher. I don't know if you gentlemen have been acquainted with him just yet, but he posited the idea that seminaries have actually contributed to this movement where Christians and the church have essentially abandoned the intellectual space of life. And that's not to say he was trying to demonize seminaries. That's not really the point. But by and large, seminaries are a relatively new idea. What we had before were universities. Theology was not confined to one corner for one group of people. Theology was the queen of the sciences that enabled people to understand every other discipline. Theology was necessary and fundamental for understanding literature and language and law and everything. And I think when those two things became divorced, when you had thinking in every space of life divorced from theology, that's when we really started to see Christianity losing its influence in culture and in the world at large. So I'd say that those are two things that I've seen that have prompted what we're describing here.
What can you define for me? I mean, you did a little bit when you talk about piety. I mean, it sounds like you're talking about a little bit of the separation of worlds. What else do you mean by? Because a lot of times people's perception of piety is like, hey, this is a good thing. We ought to be a pious people. So what do you?
Yes.
How would you define that in the negative terms of what you're talking about?
Yes, that's an excellent question, a very important question. So I think all Christians should be pious, and my understanding of the definition of pious is, I guess, holy, distinct, a people who are consecrated unto God. When I refer to pietism, what I'm referring to is this idea that the realm of Christ is limited to a few things in life, a few realms of life. Usually we think of holiness only in reference to the church and our own private devotional lives. And so it limits the scope of Christ's reign and rule in the rest of life. And we think that it is pious then to sort of confine ourselves into these specific corners and preserve our holiness in these specific corners so as to not be tainted by the world. And we don't really see ourselves as an important or necessary influence on the world. We kind of see ourselves as survivors who ought to protect our own confines and own spaces. And so that's generally how I define and describe what pietism is. And so this is not a complete slam on piety,
right,
as that is a reference to holiness, and more so to the ways in which we tend to limit the sovereignty of Christ to only a few areas of life.
That's great. I mean, it's like we care about what's happening in our little huddle, but whatever happens across the street, whatever happens at the city council meeting is like, whatever, it's not our problem.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Even though those realms really do belong to Christ.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of your listeners would be familiar with Kuyper's famous quote about every square inch belonging or under the lordship of Jesus Christ. There's a sense in which, and I'm even speaking in generally Reformed circles as well, we have this rich understanding of the sovereignty of God, but we don't know how to apply it beyond our soteriology. We love it in our understanding of Calvinism and explaining the doctrines of grace, but we don't have a concept for the sovereignty of God beyond that. What does it mean for Christ to rule over everything? Well, that means that everything, politics, economics, science, everything should be under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And I think that's where this stems is a bad theology tends to condemn the world to ruin. When we have a limited theology, a faulty understanding of who God is and his dealings with man, we as people tend to not be able to engage with the world in the ways that we've been called to engage with the world and be builders of culture in this world.
Well, it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like, you know, I don't care about the world outside. If it burns, it burns. But then, of course, it's going to burn because we're not there to like do anything about it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's another thing is I think we've actually built doctrines around that world burning. There's a sense in which we've actually developed a doctrine to facilitate our fearfulness and our pessimism, and that's disappointing. Again, we overlook who God is, what he's accomplished, and what he requires of us. Really, one of my favorite passages in the Bible is Matthew 28, that Great Commission. One of the most powerful statements, Christ declaring his victory over all things, declaring that heaven and earth belong to him, and on that basis we can go triumphantly, confidently, courageously, and win the nations for Christ because they do belong to him. That is not a pessimistic take. That is not a description of a church that is a perpetual victim of sorts. Even in the wake of persecution, Christianity has the ability to win. And that's the potency of truth. There's a sense in which we've never needed the numbers to win We've only ever needed a faithful few because we have a victorious king. And I wish more Christians would understand the potency of their faith, the potency of their king, because it's belief in that I think enables us to really win the nations the way we were called to.
Yes, this idea, backing up for a second, that that the Lord has sovereignty over not just my prayer closet, but everything outside of it as well.
Exactly. And
that He's the Lord of Lords, He's the King of Kings. The nations are Christ's inheritance, right? They are His. This is such an energizing kind of theology for me when I was first coming into this and kind of coming out of dispensationalism. I was like, this is the best thing I've ever heard. And so I could imagine our listeners having that same experience and then saying, well, what now? What do I do? Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the nations belong to Him. But what do I do now? What does it look like to begin pushing that actually into the nooks and crannies of life?
Right. Yeah, I think that's such an important question to ask. And I think, yes, it does begin with reckoning with the truth of that. But it also means starting with the immediate spaces that God has placed you in. What does it look like for Christ to be Lord over your relationships? Christ to be Lord over your environment? It starts from something as simple as making sure you're exercising good stewardship over your living spaces, making sure that you're loving your wife faithfully, making sure you're raising your children in the fear of the Lord, making sure that you're taking care of the resources that God has given you, making sure that you love your neighbor, making sure that you're taking responsibility for your community at large, and seeking to be a light and a witness right there, getting involved with whatever civic politics are happening around you as well. That's very important. Of course, participating in church life and serving God's people there as well. And then also vocationally seeking to exercise dominion through your work, over your work, recognizing that whatever it is that you're doing, whether you're engineering or plumbing or writing, all of that belongs in the realm of Christ's kingdom. And as we exercise ourselves in our vacations, we are effectively establishing Christ's kingdom here on earth, and that's where we begin. I think it's easy for us to reckon with the sovereignty of God and begin all the way up there, and think in these big terms, in terms of, okay, how can I take over the world? How can I take over my nation? How can I take over the city? But we need to recognize that faithfulness, again, begins at home. That's an old adage, but it rings true. We have to be faithful at home. I think it's in Proverbs 16 that refers to a man who can rule himself as being mightier than he who takes over a city. And I think there's apt wisdom there. Our ability to rule ourselves is what enables us then, I think, to rule cities and rule beyond the immediate spaces that we dwell in. And so I think that's where we need to begin. Going back to that every square inch idea, we need to start with the immediate square inches around us, and be faithful right there and aim to be fruitful right there as well.
So it's almost like you got these kind of concentric circles. You start in the family, and once you're ruling well there, then you slowly move out into neighborhood, into city, state, national, but keeping that bullseye there. I'm wondering, I do wonder if part of our issue is that we kind of lost our creativity to how to move beyond just our family walls. And I wonder if even like your perspective coming from another country that's on the forefront of building this, are there any things that you've seen especially fruitful in Zambia, as this is kind of a new front that's being built there, that we could learn from over here as we've kind of lost our creativity and we're kind of building, almost from a new foundation up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, I think in many ways America's more blessed than it thinks it is. There's so much going on here. Honestly, I sometimes observe the fights that happen on social media between different camps and so on, and I think to myself, these are very privileged fights that the rest of the world, like, we'll take all of you. Like, we don't care. We want faithful guys. Whereas here, it's like the smallest thing is enough to consider another anathema, which is odd. And I think while that's disappointing to see, it still does paint this picture of how the Lord has blessed America. There's a sense in which America's just been enabled with this optimistic hopefulness that's even embedded in the pagans. It's been incredible to me to see how even the non-Christians here have been influenced by a Christian ethos. Of course, they've got no idea that this is a distinctive of a Christian ethos, but it's there. So America's been greatly blessed. But what I would say is, I don't think it's rocket science to try to recover the West and recover the United States. It is going back to some of these basics and returning to the Word of God and having that reign supreme, acknowledging Christ's lordship, establishing faithful churches that are preaching God's Word and are seeking to apply it and prepare their flock to go and take action in the rest of their lives. It's Christians having kids and having as many of them as God makes possible, and raising them in the fear of the Lord and launching those arrows to devastate the world and plant flags of righteousness everywhere that they go. It's all of that. And I think, when you think about even what built the West, it was these very same things. It was holding to the principles of Scripture. It was establishing families. It was essentially applying the Great Commission and the cultural mandate. That's essentially what built America, and that's essentially what will build other nations as well. In contrast, what I've seen is what happens when a nation isn't influenced by those same principles, when a nation isn't influenced by the Bible, what happens when families are weak, when the church is weak. And so I can't give you anything very profound beyond those things. But I think that those are things, because they're so basic, they can easily be lost. And we need to make sure that they're front and center of everything that we do. I will say, though, one thing that I think we should be encouraging Christians toward is great ambition, though. And this is something that I've been thinking through. It is my firm belief that God's enemies are incapable of ambition. And what I mean by that is God's enemies seek to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Right? We read that in the text of Scripture. When the serpent is tempting Eve, he is not offering her a greater glory. In fact, he was offering her a lesser glory. And that's what devils do. They seem to paint lesser ambitions as if they're more glorious prospects, when that's not the case. And I think we should take from that that as Christians, it is a very godly thing to be ambitious, I believe. When we serve the sovereign King of the universe, who owns all things, who rules all things, who calls us to build culture and exercise dominion, to win the nations and disciple them, I can't think of a greater ambition than that. Oftentimes, and I've written about this before, our problem is that we tend to think too small. And I think we need more Christians who can be very ambitious. We need Christians who are willing to take huge risks and to do so with joy and with courage and seek to build things. We should be seeking to get to Mars before Elon Musk does, for example. We should really try our hand at things that seem audacious, honestly. Even as we try it and as we're doing it for Christendom, for the glory of Christ's kingdom, I believe that the Lord will bless those efforts because those are the very things that he has called us to do. And even in the wake of failure, I don't think those things are ever a setback in the grand narrative, this grand story that Christ is building. And so that's what we need more of. To give you another spin on this, third world countries tend to be very pessimistic, very fatalistic, and therefore they don't really build much. They lack ambition, and I think devils delight in that. And I think if there's something I would continue to encourage the church in America towards, it's feed that ambition. Feed that ambition. That's how Christendom is built. That's how truth, beauty, and goodness are established. Yeah, some thoughts there.
No, that's amazing. Although I'm unfamiliar, I didn't know that Reformed people argue online. That's shocking, shocking news. I have to look that up.
It was a shock for me too, honestly. I had no idea. I thought we had won the wars with Luther and Calvin and everything back then, but seems we still have some bones of contention.
That's great. Some people talking about negative world. Some people are saying, there's sort of a reprieve potentially in negative world with Donald Trump coming in. It kind of throwing a wrecking ball into things. So I'm wondering, do you view it similarly? And then if you do, what kind of opportunities do you think that we have as the church over the next 4 years?
That's an excellent question. I think Donald Trump's election boils down to the mercy and grace of God. It is a win that I absolutely celebrate. And honestly, I mean, just in the last month, I think we're exactly a month into his presidency to the day. It's incredible what's already been accomplished. I think he has far exceeded even our expectations of what he would get done, and in a relatively short space of time. And I think this really is a time for the church to build. I think this is a time for the church to assume more responsibility for their counties, for their states, for the nations at large. I think there's also a temptation behind this as well. The temptation is to think that we've already won. The temptation to think that wokeness has been weeded out, that DEI has been weeded out, that all the vices that concern us have been weeded out. But that's not the case. The nations can only be discipled by the church. There's a sense in which the state doesn't have all the tools for discipling the nations. It has a tool. It has the tool of justice. It has the sword, which is a potent tool in Christendom, I believe, that ought to be wielded faithfully. But we ought to be ensuring that we ourselves, as the church, are strengthening efforts. I think we need to be encouraging and preparing more of our people to assume political offices. I think we need a lot more of that. I think we need to encourage more of our flocks to pursue enterprise and be innovative, and to really just use this as a season to build Christian institutions far and wide. I think we have a real opportunities to continue to build schools. I think we've already been doing this, but I think that we should aim higher, go bigger, and see this as an opportunity. So while I think, generally speaking, conservatives have the White House, we do not yet have the culture. Secular humanism is still embedded in academia, for example. Paganism is still portrayed through our entertainment and media, and we need to win those areas as well. And so I think this is a season for Christians to really come together and I think figure out ways of investing very big into taking dominion of these spaces. And if we don't utilize this opportunity well, I think we'll be surprised we'll be surprised how quickly we could fall back into what we just got out of. The left is not defeated. They're still a formidable behemoth that needs to be beheaded, and we have our work cut out for us. I think what God has given us in this election is reprieve, and we now need to use this as an opportunity to really build. And I think also to really use this as an opportunity to influence people who are now willing to listen. We have the exclusive blueprint of flourishing, of freedom, of true freedom and flourishing as Christians. A godless conservatism does not have the keys to freedom and flourishing. Only a Christ-centered conservatism has the keys to freedom and flourishing. And this is something we need to be louder about. This is something we need to proclaim with confidence and courage, and just seek to influence all the spaces around us with that way of thinking.
Well, no, you brought up a good point at the end, which I was going to try to find a way to ask you, is a lot of the conservatism that is taking over our country is a godless conservatism. Like, it's people that maybe are conservatives, or maybe, a few years ago actually weren't considered conservative at all, but now they've jumped on that bandwagon. And it seems like even having a godless conservatism actually gives opportunities for the church to kind of build a foundation of raising up politicians that love the Lord. I think one of the things, I was re-listening to our interview with Aaron Renn and talking about how, it used to be that Protestants were the dominant religious force, but now it's the Catholic Church is, and Protestants are seen as the peasants. And so oftentimes when someone rises to office, they become Catholic because that's they're the ones that hold those keys. So even for the Protestant church to re-engage that intellectual, that cultural cachet is going to be vital to be able to sustain these things, which I think is what you're talking about. This is not the end. This is the beginning. This is an opening, and now we need to take advantage of this opening and do the hard work.
Right. I think part of the reason there, and I mean, this is sort of my take on this. I'm sure other people might have a better take on why this is the case. But I think people are compelled by frameworks that seem to have more of a robust and holistic framework of thinking. Catholicism, to its credit, has long had a pedagogy, a culture of its own, a holistic culture that seems to feed many different areas of life. And again, I think as Protestants, because we resigned ourselves to this pietism that we spoke about earlier, we have not profoundly offered our own holistic paideia of sorts,
right.
a holistic way of living life in every area of life. We have somewhat diminished our own voice as it relates to things like political theology, economic theory, all of that. And I think we need to recover that. And I wonder if that's why people gravitate more towards Catholicism, because it's got this tradition that appears compelling, at least at the outset.
Yeah, it's like we put ourselves in this little timeout, and we're like, no, you guys can go play. We're fine sitting here on the bench.
It.
Yeah,
that's exactly it. And so we need to recover that, and especially because Protestant theology is what built the West. Catholicism did not build the West. The West was built in spite of Catholicism, not because of it. It was the Reformation that brought about the greatest era of prosperity in the Western world. And I think we need to recover the ideals that existed in Protestantism at that time and bring that back now. So while, yeah, it seems like we've put ourselves in timeout, it's not even that the world tried to put us on timeout and we accepted it.
Yeah.
It's just that we did that to ourselves. And so I think we need to recover that. And I think we have a real opportunity to do that now, and consolidate our own thinking and really offer something compelling and robust to a world that seems desperate for answers.
That's great. One thing that Ray kind of talks about, he kind of takes aim at, culture warring, but then he also takes aim at kind of cultural transformation. Like, he's saying in every world, it kind of requires different things. So if you're in a positive world, it requires something, neutral world requires something, negative world, what kind of approach do you think we need to take? And then maybe secondarily to that, some Christians will say we need to build a complete counterculture that overtakes the current culture. Or, do we do like the left did and do a long march through the institutions and then just take back, what culture's there? Whatever kind of answer you think is good from that concoction of a question. What do you think?
Yes. Yeah, I'd say we could probably borrow a bit of everything there. I think fundamentally it's important for us to build a counterculture. Sorry. I think for a long time we tried to sort of fit in and see if we could flip the culture as it is now and just sort of trim some of its rough edges. And that sort of winsome approach, I think, has taken us nowhere. If anything, we look more like the world than the world looks like the church because of it. And that's a problem. And honestly, I think what we need to return to really is just an understanding of what it means to be a holy people. When we think of the word holy, when many people think of the word holy, they think in monk-like categories. And we don't often think of just the actual root word of it being us being people who are set apart, people who are distinct, salt and light, people who are a city on a hill. And I think that's actually a description of a people who are fundamentally countercultural, a people who have a different way of thinking, a different use of language, a different way of engaging with neighbor, a different way of raising kids and educating them, a different way of going about our work. Like ours is a completely different culture. And I think we need to be in the serious business of building that kind of culture, and doing so unashamedly. And so I do think that we need to be countercultural in that sense. I think for a long time we've wanted a Christianity without wars, a Christianity without battles. We've wanted a Christianity that is winsome and persuasive and nice, and that looks compelling to a world that is just misunderstood or misguided in many people's minds. And if they can just see that we're really nice people, then maybe they'll want to join our team. But that hasn't worked. No culture, no Christian culture has ever been built but while trying to negotiate with God's enemies. Negotiate with a compromise and you'll become just like them. And so we need to create a very strong counterculture. Now I would expand on that and say one of the ways that we do that is by actually building distinct institutions. That should be our business. We need to be in the business of establishing all kinds of institutions, from businesses to schools, anything that we can possibly think of. I think that's a very tangible way of building culture. Of course, also while not neglecting the fundamental institutions of family and church. So we need churches, we need families, and we need good, strong Christian civic governments as well, right? And I think those institutions ought not to be ignored as the fundamental basis upon which other institutions can flourish. And I think that's probably one of the most palpable things we could establish as a counterculture to the world around us. So yeah, we need Christians who are willing to actually get into the fight and be combative, because we are at war. Ephesians 6 profoundly paints this picture of warfare, and this is actually what we're up against. And we ought to be on the front foot. We ought to be swinging hard, fighting and building. And I think that's what it takes. And that's not to say I think that means that we should be snarky about it necessarily, or just jerks about it. And what I mean by that is sometimes people hear this and they think, okay, I guess we're just going to be a rowdy bunch who care about nothing, and we're just going to essentially wield a wrecking ball to everything. I think there's a sense in which we still ought to be the kinds of people who can lay down very strong arguments, people who can debate, which I think, by the way, I think the church has lost its capacity to debate. Those social media wars actually reveal that. We don't know how to talk to each other anymore. We don't know how to debate anymore. And this is just within our own circles. And I think because of that, we don't know how to communicate with the world either. We've lost our capability to engage in compelling rhetoric, and that is actually powerful and potent. And I think we need to recover that. So, ours is a faith of construction. Ours is a faith of building things that are truly glorious. Yes, sure, while still doing damage to idolatry all around us. Absolutely. I'll be the first to wield the wrecking ball for that. But recognizing that ours is not, some people like to think of abrasion as a pure tactic for this counterculture. And I think we should be abrasive towards idolatry. But I think we should also be showing people a higher way. We should have a higher culture, so to speak.
Well, and ultimately, that is probably the most biblical winsomeness that you could have, is you showcase it, being the salt and light, building that city on a hill. I mean, that's going to be attractive to people. And It's a non-compromising, hey, we're going to build this beautiful thing. We think this is actually the best thing for flourishing, is actually to say no to this, say yes to this. And that will be an attractive thing to people. But when we're offering half-hearted, half-worldly things, it's like, well, I don't really need that. I can, or if you take it, you bring your idolatry with you, and it's never dealt with.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, some of what you're saying here it kind of explains what we were talking about a moment ago about why Catholicism seems to be taking such a foothold in many conservative circles again. I think it's because it has some of these compelling elements that I think we need to recover. What I'm about to say is going to sound very controversial, but I think Christianity is the ultimate colonialism that ought to happen.
Amen. I say the same thing. Actually, that's great.
Yeah, there's a place for colonialism of the Christian kind, and I am a champion of colonialism as and when it is a catalyst for Christendom. I firmly believe that. But with colonialism, what essentially you're doing is creating civility. You are establishing civilization. And what we need is a good, strong, robust Christian civility. And I think that's the way we build this compelling counterculture that is just undeniably potent. And you can see its potency even historically. I'm not sure you fellas are you might be acquainted with Tom Holland. Former atheist who's now a Spider-Man.
Wrong Tom Holland.
Yes. And so, of course, Tom Holland, in simply doing a skeptical analysis of the history of the West, couldn't deny the potency of Christianity. And I think that shows you just how potent our faith is. And what he was looking at, essentially what made the case for him, was actually Christian civility. That's what made a case for him. Less so the actual arguments, more so the actual things that were built by Christendom, things built by the church. That's what made a compelling case. And I think that those are the kinds of things we need to be establishing. We need to be the ultimate connoisseurs of language and seem to impart that kind of civility on the cultures that we're seeking to shape. We ought to be the most influential artists in that regard, creating the most compelling artistic landscapes. We ought to be the most ambitious engineers, the most eloquent lawyers, all of that. We need to be builders of civilization. And I think that's the compelling case that no other religion can really counter. And those are the kinds of things we need to be focused on building. And I'll even stretch this out to say, I think that is the stuff of the gospel. Usually we truncate the gospel to only dealing with atonement, only dealing with justification. Maybe we get to sanctification sometimes, but we need to understand that the gospel as a whole, the gospel is not just a way for us to punch our tickets to heaven. The gospel is the means through which God is redeeming the world and establishing a kingdom. That is the gospel. It is the gospel of the kingdom. And I think we need to recover that robust understanding of what the gospel is.
The nice thing is, like you're saying, like with the arts and all this building, we have a heritage of this, so it's not like we've never done this before. And it's like recovering what was lost, but then building on it and taking it further than it's ever been before. And that's kind of that's the work that's before us and that the Lord has equipped us to.
Amen.
No, he has equipped us to it. Yeah. No,
that's great.
Go ahead, brother.
No, sorry. I was, I want to be respectful of your time. So I was, thinking this is a good time to wind this down. And I was going to ask you, kind of follow up, kind of just here right at the end. What are a couple of takeaways from this that you think, I just listened to this podcast. What are some takeaways you think I should have walking away from this that would be important and actually, maybe actionable in my life?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Yeah, so I mean, the context of this is just negative world, understanding that we live in a culture that is aggressively opposed to Christianity, and in reckoning this, we need to understand that as Christians, we have the potency to flip the tables here, and the world has become what it is largely because of our own unbelief. Our own misunderstanding of who God is, what He has done in His redemption, and who He has made us to be. And if we can recover that, an understanding and a real belief in that, we can actually turn this world upside down. And negative world is more of, I'd say, a critique of the church's failure than it is of the potency of God's enemies. The power is on our side because we worship the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We worship the creator of the universe. We actually win down here. And in places where that victory is yet to be fully manifested, it's often because the church has not yet assumed its duty to disciple the nations. I think that's one takeaway from this, and I think something I should absolutely add to this whole conversation around how to live in negative world is to live with joy and optimism. Really, in our assessments of negative world, that shouldn't make us droop our heads and complain and whine. I have a friend who often likes to say that whining is losing. And as Christians, we have become very proficient at whining and complaining. And I think it's about time that we brought a flare of joy and optimism to a world that is languishing, in a world that has become almost obsessed with the crisis of mental health, depression, and all of that. Wouldn't it just be so powerful for Christians to live with joy and optimism? Joy and optimism are contagious. And I think it's one of the most important things that any leader could wield. And I think it's time that we as God's people started to live with real optimism and joy. And not an empty optimism and joy. We have every reason to be optimistic and joyful. Again, we serve the Lord of Lords. We serve the King of Kings. He is victorious. He is ruling. He is reigning. He is winning. He is fulfilling his promises. He is keeping covenant with his people. He is redeeming this world. Our hope is one that is anchored in truth. And for that reason, we ought to be the most joyful and the most optimistic in negative world. And through that, I think the Lord could actually change things altogether. And we could, through our joy and optimism, usher in a world where every knee bows before Christ.
Amen to that on all accounts. That's the perfect place to end this. And so where can people go to follow you, to follow your content and just be involved with what you're doing?
I appreciate that. So if you just look for my name, Lennox Kalifungwa, I'm on at least all the major social media channels. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you'll find me. I believe I'm the only Lennox Kalifungwa out there. So that should be pretty easy to find. And then I'm also on Substack. If you just look for Lennox Kalifungwa on Substack, I write on a channel called State of Mind. And then on New St. Andrews College's blog, I write there quite a bit as well. And on its YouTube channel, I've got that podcast of Flames and Crowns. So if you look up Of Flames and Crowns, I believe we're the only Of Flames and Crowns out there. So wherever you listen to your podcasts, on YouTube as well, you will find me.
Awesome. Well, Lennox, thank you so much for your time, for doing this podcast. This was great.
Thank you so much for the invitation, brothers. This has been terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, go give us 5 stars and check out our Patreon for more kind of exclusive content and conversations with our guests. And until next time, labora ad gloriam.